So a lot of the brown bag lunches now I come across by accident, and Thomas Cannell is one of them. I kept seeing this name, you know, reading about different things, and his name just kept popping up, and I remembered, like, oh yeah, I read about this, read about that, and then decided there really was enough to do a brown bag lunch on him. So who was Thomas Cannell? Thomas Cannell was baptized in Bally, Isle of Man on September 25th, 1826. He led a remarkable life. Jackson Sentinel obituary for Cannell was published February 21st, 1889. Survivors included his wife and an adopted daughter to mourn his loss. The funeral occurred at the Congregational Church and was attended in a body of Knights Templar and Blue Lodge Masons, of which he was honored. High degree number. He died at the age of 63 from typhoid fever. Typhoid fever was common in Iowa in the 1800s, as was cholera, smallpox, typhus, yellow fever, and scarlet fever. It was one of the many highly contagious diseases that threatened the lives of early Iowa settlers. These diseases could spread quickly from person to person and affect entire families. Thomas Cannell was just 6 months old when brought to the United States by his parents. His twin passed away soon after the arrival of the family in Ohio. At that time, the family consisted of the father and mother, the grandfather, Patrick Cannell, and the two sons, John and Thomas. They were numbered among the early settlers when the country was a wilderness. Thomas became a pioneer at a very young age. He and his wife, Mariette, are buried in Mount Hope Cemetery. Mariette Amelia Farr was the daughter of Harry and Mary Ann Crane Farr. She survived her husband by more than 33 years. Besides his twin brother, another sibling of Cannell died young, John William, who immigrated on July 7, 1827, drowned while swimming in the Shaker Lake and is buried in Cleveland, Ohio. New York arriving passenger list showing the Cannell family on the top line, which I know you can't really probably see it very well from there. I just think it's so amazing that we can find these documents now so easily when years ago, I mean, I would have had to wait 6 months to get a copy of something like that. Thomas was the son of John N. and Jane Quiggin Cannell. John and Jane were born in 1800 in Isle of Man, Scotland, and died in Ohio. And it's pretty amazing that, you know, those pictures exist for them, but I could not find one for Thomas. Thomas's grandfather was Patrick Cannell. Patrick held strong religious views as a follower of John Wesley, was reverenced as both teacher and preacher for many years. His influence contributed towards creating a moral and intellectual atmosphere in the home, which placed the family on par with those who built up the famous Western Reserve. And for those of you not familiar with John Wesley, he was an English cleric, theologian, and evangelist who was a leader of a revival movement within the Church of England known as Methodism. Thomas Cannell grew to be a sturdy youth, and being next to the oldest child was of necessity obliged to share and bear the arduous work that fell to the lot of those who settled in the Ohio wilderness 83 years ago. And I'm going to be talking about quoting words from the Ellis history, and I guess maybe somebody can explain this to me, but so when Ellis wrote that history, apparently he took other people, actually, he was quoting other people because that's the way it sounds. And what's kind of fascinating about what was written in the history is he had kept this diary for several years when he traveled out west and talked to Bonnie, talked to Kara, and we do not know where that is, but it would be a wonderful artifact to find that someday. So the 1833 sketch of Ohio was shown, And then this I'll be quoting from the Ellis History, which apparently it was a woman that had written some of this stuff. So at the age of 13, Thomas left the farm, going to Cleveland to become self-supporting. He entered the home of a wealthy and benevolent lady, Mrs. Ruth Weatherly, who took a loving interest in the boy's reading, study, and general welfare. His earning capacity was recognized at once, so that besides supporting himself, he contributed the first year to the support of his father's family by purchasing the white flour for their use, which at that time was a luxury. Thus laid the foundation for those qualities which characterized all the activities of his later years. He never mentioned his early experience as a hardship, but only as an opportunity for service. Mrs. Weatherly, with whom he lived and whom he held in high esteem, wished to adopt the lad and educate him. And I don't know if she ever succeeded in adopting him or not, but she touched his life to finer issues than any he had experienced as a hewer of wood and drawer of water. And she is entitled to a place in the sketch of which she had a part during the most impressionable period of his career. The writer, and again, the writer has in her possession, so I'm not sure who that is, who that writer is, a book, gilt-edged and finely illustrated, which she gave him for a keepsake in 1841, when he was 15 years of age. On a flyleaf is her name as his sincere friend. The many poems it contains, as well as a story of ancient Greece, bespeaks the character of further illustration of Shakespeare's words. How far that little candle throws its beam, so shines a good deed in a naughty world. Cannell came to Maquoketa as a young man. After arriving in this little western town, he worked at his trade, that of shoemaker, and entered into the social life of the place as he found it at that early date. He was a good singer and fond of music. He became a member of a church choir and taught singing in the country schoolhouses. The records of the Jackson Lodge, IOOF, which was organized about this time, show that Mr. Cannell was one of the charter members. The Jackson Lodge, number 33, Independent Order of Odd Fellows, instituted in Maquoketa on October 1852, with 5 charter members: Cannell, John Pope, J.N. Felton, Job Tobias, and L.G. Ransom. The purpose of this lodge, which met weekly, was to visit the sick, relieve the distressed, bury the dead, and educate the orphan. They had previously met in what was later the Graham store. The gold excitement in 1853, which took possession of hundreds of men fond of adventure, led him to join a company which left Maquoketa on the 29th of March that year. Do we have more information about that? We do, okay. Journeying overland in covered wagons. The writer has his diary, and again, I don't know who that writer is, which he kept from the day he left Maquoketa until he arrived at his destination on the 27th of August. During 5 months of travel, tramping, and camping, he recorded the experiences of each day and the prevailing conditions under which the journey was made. It gives the names and descriptions of the rivers crossed, the mountains climbed, the general aspect of the country, the scarcity or abundance of feed for the horses, etc. And again, because there were excerpts of this in the history book, I'm able to tell you a little bit about that trip. June 9th, traveled 16 miles, very rough road, black hills, best scenery I ever saw. Sioux Village, 150 wigwams. And I just try to picture in my mind what that would look like to come upon that and see. June 10th, traveled 18 miles, hilly roads, the best scenery yet. He said that before though. Good grass and water. July 5th, traveled 8 miles, high hill, crossed Bear River, camped 2 days, caught fresh salmon trout. July 12th, passed through Salt Lake City, beautiful valley, 30 miles wide. And I was just there last year. Obviously, it didn't look anything like that. August 27th thus ended the first overland route of TEC. I don't know what that stands for, TEC. Of TEC to California. Does anybody know what those initials? What?
No, it's the initials.
Oh, it is. Gosh, it is his initials. Wow. You know, that just escaped me. Yeah, Thomas E. Cannell. I thought it was like the name of, something.
They get a gold star.
Yeah. See, it's good to ask the audience. They sometimes do have the answers. The same notebook contains several stanzas of a number of old-time songs, such as Sweet Afton, Long, Long Ago, etc., which indicates how some of the monotony of camp life was enlivened. The notebook also gave the following dates and locations to indicate their progress. South Fork of the American River, July 30th, 1854. Doolittle Ranch, January 3rd, 1855. Then, on leaving California, he boarded a boat and sailed for New York via Panama. In 1956, Mr. Cannell again became a resident of Maquoketa with the intention of making it his future home, and the little growing town became the center of his ambition. In 1859, he wedded Marietta Farr of the same town. She was born in Moriah, New York, and was descended on the maternal side from the Mayflower passengers, John Alden and Priscilla Mullins. Proving her eligibility many years afterward, she became a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution through her mother's grandfather, Joseph Crane, Jr. He enlisted in 1777 under Captain Aaron Smith to reinforce the Northern Army and served in Captain John Armstrong's company of Massachusetts Militia, 1781 in Rhode Island. So this picture, which we did have posted on our Facebook page, and I don't know if anybody really took a close look at the boot, but does that look comfortable to you? The way that boot is, the arch that comes up? Thomas Cannell, many times in his later years, generously attributed much of his success in life to his wife's industry and thrift, perhaps a heritage from her New England ancestry. I think they said that same thing about somebody else, I can't think, that donated to the Congregational Church. They said that about him or his wife, Boardman. Yeah, I think that same thing was said. He founded the Boot and Shoe House and remained in the same business and location for over 28 years. He first did business in a frame structure and in 1872 erected on the same side the brick building which was still standing in 1910. His younger brother Henry was an apprentice shoemaker with the company. After the war broke out, Henry enlisted September 20th, 1862 as a corporal, 5th class with Company F, 31st Infantry, and he was 21 years old. He was promoted to full sergeant, 2nd class, in 1863. He died of disease, June 25th, 1864, in Nashville, Tennessee. He was originally buried in the National Cemetery at Nashville and was later removed to Harvard Grove and reinterred in the family plot. So this advertisement appeared in 1878 in the Jackson Sentinel. It pays to trade on the east side of Main Street with T.E. Cannell, dealer in boots and shoes. Lyons patent, metal stiffeners prevent boots and shoes from running over, wearing off on the side and ripping in the seams. For sale at Cannell's. And again, that looks like the most uncomfortable boot. This ad from 1871 reads immense stock of boots and shoes at the Chicago Boot and Shoe Emporium of Thomas E. Cannell. Cash paid for any quantity of hides. Thomas E. Cannell, Maquoketa. And so I'm wondering that word Chicago, what does that mean? He had a store can anybody else interpret that? That he had a store or that it came from? But I thought he made his boots, so I don't know how they could come from Chicago. Does that make sense to you? Because nothing else has said that, he lived in Chicago, so I'm sure on that. Cannell boot and shoe business was later conducted by H. Reed and Company, as shown in this advertisement. 123 North Main Street, noted in this ad, is where the Schenthaler Law Building is. And since the Law Building was built in 1946, it can't be the same building that housed the boot and shoe business. The ad states, the Big Shoe Store was established by T.E. Cannell in 1851. I like this, noted in the ad, we sew rips free of charge. So that must have been a thing back then that, of course you wouldn't have multiple pairs of shoes probably. And I'm not quite sure how to interpret this, but this is the 1860 products of industry. So I'm just going to read what it says on those lines, and maybe from there we can kind of figure out. But and this was for Maquoketa. So on line 6, Thomas E. Cannell is listed, and then under the category, what type of business says boots and shoes. Capital invested was $500. Raw material quantities listed was 4,000. So I don't know if that's in dollars, maybe it is. Values listed was 1,500. Average number of hands employed was 4, so whether or not he counted himself, but he did have employees. And this fact is kind of amazing. Annual products, 1,000 pairs. That just seems like a lot. And then values, 3,000. So if you sold 1,000 pairs and values 3,000, does that mean they were maybe average $3 a pair? Would that be the way to interpret that? I'm just not really sure what those numbers. But that would be quite a, well, of course they made the shoes though too, so you have to have that labor factored in there. It was Mr. Cannell's earnest desire to aid in every legitimate way the advancement of the town, even to sacrificing his private interest. He was a member of the city council in 1862 and 63, and in 1864 he was chosen mayor. He was elected mayor a total of 5 times. He was re-elected in 1865. Shown are all the mayors who preceded him. And many of these names may be familiar to you, like Millard or Millard. Is it Millard? Pronounced Millard? With Millard's addition. And then Harrison, who would be a descendant of board member Sarah Jones, I believe. 7 years after his first 2 terms, he was again re-elected as mayor. Again, notice all the familiar names on this page. Colonel Joseph J. Woods, Dr. John Allen, Gary Jacobson, Benjamin Spencer, maybe not so familiar, and I'm not familiar with Franklin Destley. I've not seen that name before. 7 years later, he was re-elected again. More familiar names in Maquoketa history. Goodnow, Mitchell, Stevens, Hubble, Thompson. Again, 5 years later, he was elected. Note familiar names, Sanborn and Peck. And I think what they did was they kept re-electing him, like when there was something important going on and they needed him in that position, that was what had happened. Thomas E. Cannell served as supervisor in 1864, along with P.C. Burke, S. Thompson, James Taylor, Alexander Galloway, John Wilson, W.T. Winecoop, and J.A. Tritz. He also served as supervisor in 1870 with Alexander Reed, N.C. White, Arnold Railing, John Holroyd, Zach DeGroat, John Redden, J.L. Taylor, and C.L. Clausen. And all of those names are familiar to me. I don't know, if they are familiar to all of you. Cannell worked unremittently for a railroad to the town and was most happy in 1870 when Maquoketa joined the city of Davenport by rail. The railroad completion was in 1870. The Dubuque Daily Times, November 9, 1870, printed, The Maquoketa people are agitating for a celebration upon the completion of the Davenport and St. Paul Railroad to that place. The Sentinel says that portion of the road operated between DeWitt and Davenport is already doing business much greater than most had anticipated. From parties who have passed over the line, we learned that the passenger traffic is already quite large, and it's steadily increasing. The morning train frequently brings up 50 or more through passengers. The Davenport and St. Paul drove the first spike about the middle of July, 1870, with the Midland's first spike, a brass one, being driven on August 13, 1870. The two companies raced to reach Maquoketa first, then ended with an apparent tie. When the Davenport and St. Paul was completed, the Midland had reached Elmer, where the two roads intersected. The Davenport and St. Paul allowed the Midland to use their tracks to come into Maquoketa for a joint celebration on December 13, 1870. The Jackson Sentinel carried the story of the arrival and the celebration on the front page. And on December 15th, this article also contained one of the earliest references to the nickname Timber City, which W.H. Caron had bestowed on Maquoketa in 1870. With the arrival of the railroad, building materials were more readily available, and lumber yards sprang up near the two depots, the Midland south of downtown near Mill Creek, and the Davenport and St. Paul east of downtown near Platt and Dearborn. Carpenters and builders took advantage of the newly available materials, and houses and buildings were soon under construction all over town. New hotels were needed to house the travelers and salesmen arriving by train. One of the new hotels was called the Midland House, in honor of that railroad. The Maquoketa Excelsior began 1872 with Happy New Year. The past year has been fraught with important results. To our timber city, completion of the railroad, nearly $100,000 too, expended in building and an improvement in business. Headline, 1,500 persons visit Maquoketa on early railroad excursion. It seems that in the good old days, whole towns and the surrounding countryside took time to get acquainted. Jackson Sentinel of December 15, 1870 printed, Tuesday lasts as a day ever remembered by the people of Maquoketa, as the day upon which the cities of Lyons, Clinton, Davenport, and Maquoketa were formally united by bands of iron and hooks of steel. The chief factor in the uniting, however, seems to have been all the food in Maquoketa and vicinity, which turned over to the invading but welcome hordes of neighboring townsmen. To the number it was estimated of 1,500 persons. And when they all dined, the fragments of this royal feast still remaining were sufficient enough to have fed a small army. The schedule of events in general was this. 11 o'clock saw Maquoketans at the depot to welcome the trains filled with the shouting visitors. The Davenport band came along, which discoursed most excellent music throughout the day. From the depot, the guests were taken to the receptions at public halls and in private residences. When all the trains had arrived, people were taken 400 at a time to Schrader's Hall, where they came upon turkeys to the right of them, chickens to the left, and pastries in front. And then, well fed, they were turned loose to inspect the city and to talk at greater lengths with the citizens until 3 o'clock, when most of them boarded the trains. Lost my place. Most of them boarded the trains for home. The report says that some stayed overnight, getting their fill of dancing and good music. The Jackson County Fair Association won Cannell's hearty support. A former history states that in 1869, he purchased the land now owned by the Fair Association with other citizens and was one of its largest stockholders. On Sunday, October 1st, 1882, fire again struck Main Street, this time on the east side. 5 large business houses were the prey of the flames. The blaze, just north of the D.H. Anderson building, appears to have removed the last wood frame buildings on Main Street between Platte and Pleasant. The rebuilding of the burnt district was started in the spring as soon as weather allowed. The most important impact of the 1882 fire made it obvious the need for a waterworks. Though this had been under discussion off and on for years, the fire forced action. The mayor and city council members visited towns with the municipal waterworks, and by April 1882 they approved plans and specs and instructed the water committee to advertise in the Chicago Times for their immediate construction. Water will be pumped to and distributed from an 80-foot standpipe. The cost was to be $23,983. It was Cannell that labored unceasingly to establish the system of waterworks for the town. In 1873, the county treasurer, after 6 years of service, became a defaulter to the sum of $51,000. It was Cannell who realized a 25% indebtedness for the county. The story is told in the Annals of Jackson County as follows. Frederick Scarborough had been clerk of district court for a number of years, previous to 1865. At the time, the salary of the clerk was paid by allowing him a certain salary, a part which would come from the fees of his office. And the deficit was to be made up by the county treasury. Under this plan, if clerk failed to report a fee, it was that much more added to the amount necessary to make up the salary. At the time of Scarborough's retirement from the office in 1865, it was discovered that a large amount of fees had never been reported. A committee was appointed to examine the books. The committee found a deficit of over $5,000, which they reported at the June meeting, 1865. The suit brought by the county against the sureties of Scarborough ran along for some 2 years. Judgment was secured before Judge Cotton for $2,442 and costs. This was finally comprised still further by the release of the bondsman upon the payment of $2,000 into the county treasury. In 1873, on the Monday morning following the vote, which changed the county seat from Andrew to Macokota, the front door of the courthouse was found standing open. The treasurer's office in a disordered condition, the treasury safe open and the papers scattered about the floor. A robbery was reported. A card was found near the safe containing the combination, and the dial plate on the inner doors had been removed, on the inside of which were the characters which were the open sesame to the money box itself. The treasurer gave out that the safe had been robbed of $20,000. His own report made a few days later showed a deficit of nearly $41,000. The burglary story then ceased to be credible, if any credence had ever been placed on it. Has anyone heard this story before? I had not either. The defaulter had been treasurer for 6 years. His books were examined by a committee, and a shortage of $51,000 was reported. The ex-treasurer made an assignment of his real estate, etc., to T.E. Cannell, Esquire of Macokota, and under the bankruptcy law, settlement of his estate was made for the benefit of his creditors, Jackson County being by far the largest claimant. From this was realized a dividend of some 25%. Suit was brought against the defaulter's bondsman for the balance of the indebtedness. A change of venue was taken to Clinton County, July 12, 1875. Judgment was rendered in the sum of $25,000. Some $1,400 had been placed to the credit of his sureties, who presented a petition signed by more than half the voters, praying that the bondsman be released upon paying $5,000 into the treasury. The board finally settled with the sureties for a little more than that amount. Criminal proceedings were commenced against the embezzler. He was sentenced to 3 years in the state penitentiary and to pay a fine of $41,000. The latter was remitted and his term in prison was shortened by executive clemency, which set him free in October 1876. And maybe we just don't know about this since it was moved to the other county.
What was his name? Who's the guy that embezzled?
Scarborough.
Scarborough, okay.
Yeah. In 1841, after Jackson County had become a part of Iowa Territory, the territorial legislature appointed a committee to select a spot in the center of each county for the county seat, and as Andrew proved to be the nearest the county's geographical center, the court was moved there from Bellevue. And so a lot of this is going to sound familiar to you, but it kind of all goes with Mr. Cannell. Maquoketa put up its first battle for the honor of county seat in 1848, 10 years after its founding. A petition from Maquoketa citizens was printed in Dubuque's Weekly Minor Express, proposing this town as one of the points to be voted on at the coming election for the county seat. 3 main reasons for the choice of Maquoketa were set forth. It already had a considerable amount of business. Second, there was much undeveloped water power in the vicinity, giving promise to a great future for the town. And third, the people of Maquoketa were willing to do right by the county. To prove the last point, each of the 30 signers of the petition agreed to give a certain sum of money to build a courthouse, the amounts varying from Mr. Goodnow's pledge of $400 down to $5 offered by 2 men. These inducements were not enough for Bellevue won the election. In 1856, a contest was held between Bellevue and a proposed town of Centerville, which was to be built on the Butterworth farm north of Andrew. Bellevue won by a big majority, and Centerville never came into being. The following year, another election was held as a result of a petition put forth by the residents of Fulton, but Bellevue again won, this time by a majority of 20 votes. The election was contested, but the trial was never held, as both sides had cast so many illegal ballots, it would have been impossible to prove who had been more guilty. Andrew had already built a stone jail when it had been the county capital in earlier years, and upon promising to furnish a courthouse free for 5 years, finally succeeded in wresting the county seat away from Bellevue in 1860. With that defeat, the river town ceased its efforts ever again to regain the seat of government. Cannell was generally thought to be a good man, available in every emergency. There had been for some time a desire on the part of the people in the southern portion of the county to remove the county seat from Andrew to Maquoketa, where it would seem to accommodate a larger number of people. And in 1873, the leading citizens felt the time was ripe for some well-laid plans in that direction. At a meeting of the citizens of Maquoketa held at Schrader's Hall on April 1st, 1873, it was the unanimous voice of the meeting to proceed to immediate action for the removal of the county seat to Maquoketa. After serious consideration, plans began to crystallize and take definite shape. Men began to line up as they were putting shoulder to shoulder for one supreme effort. Special elections were held, and the most substantial argument would appear to the voters throughout the county, which would be the building of a good brick building in which to house the county archives when the seat of government was transferred. Important committees would need to be chosen, and therefore, as a preliminary measure, T. Cannell was elected mayor, so they keep putting him in there when they need him. The newspapers were full of the county seat controversy for the next several months. Since Maquoketa was not actually the county seat, they could not legally build a courthouse, but they could build a new city hall, and they did. The Excelsior kept its readers informed about the progress of the City Hall courthouse, from excavation through the foundation and the laying up of the walls. It was planned to have the building completed so that the court would be held there immediately following the election. Even though the work on the building had to be suspended for a while because there were not enough bricks available, it just took 90 days from the breaking of ground for the foundation to the completion of the roof and cornice. The citizens of Maquoketa flocked to the polls, and when the October election was over, Maquoketa had a majority of 179 votes. When the time arrived for the transfer of the offices, here again they named Mr. Cannell, he took charge of the auditor's office. On November 9, 1873, 75 farmers with their teams helped move county records, furniture, etc. from Andrew to Maquoketa without incident or accident. 3 years later, Andrew failed in an attempt to regain the county seat. With the county seat in the new courthouse, the impact was felt in the city of Maquoketa. Just as the railroad had spurred growth through the readily availability of materials, ease of travel and access to outside markets, so the designation as county seat also spurred growth. People coming to town on county business at the courthouse began bringing their families too. One trip took care of legal business, groceries, clothing, wagon repairs, and often included a trip to the Opera House. More people moved to Maquoketa. Businessmen saw the chance to establish a new business in a thriving community. Attorneys wanted to be close to the courthouse, and this created a demand for more office space. With more people, there was an increased need for doctors and teachers, and all of these people needed somewhere to live. By 1875, the population was listed as 2,112, an increase of 51% in just a decade. Cannell had been a Freemason for some years. In about 1878, when the Tancred Commandery was organized, he became one of the charter members. In choosing commissioners for the Paris Exposition, Governor Sherman honored him with an appointment. Buren Robin Sherman served as Iowa's 12th governor in 1877. Sherman served as governor of Iowa from 1882 to 1886. The exposition was held to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the storming of the Bastille, which marked the beginning of the French Revolution and was also seen as a way to stimulate the economy and pull France out of an economic recession. It was for this occasion that the Eiffel Tower was built. In 1864, Cannell ran for senator on the county ticket. On the Democratic ticket was Pierce Mitchell. You probably know a lot about this story, don't you?
Not this one.
No? Okay. And John Watson. And it had a G beside his name, so Roger was, did they used to call Independence? Was that, what is the letter G? Do you know? Okay. Well, Watson received 389 votes. Cannell received 1,978, and the winner was Mitchell with 2,246 votes. Towns with the largest support for Mitchell included Butler, Fairfield, Washington, Tatymore, Prairie Springs, Otter Creek, and Jackson, while Cannell was heavily favored in Iowa, Monmouth, Peoria, and South Fork. Then I also read about his political career, but then I really couldn't find anything, to back this up. It says, although a strong Republican in principle, Cannell had many friends among the Democrats. And in 1879, when a candidate for state senator, he ran very far ahead of his ticket, in spite of the fact that the county elections usually showed a large Democratic majority. I couldn't find where he won, but if he ran far ahead, so just not sure about that. Because it looked like Mitchell was still, in office at that time. For several years, Cannell had been a director in the First National Bank and eventually became president of the institution, holding that position when he passed away on the 16th of February, 1889. Mr. Cannell possessed a generous, charitable, and forgiving disposition, and his optimistic spirit drew strong men into the tie of friendship and held them there. Being thus endowed, it was only natural that his religious views should be those of the Universalist faith, which he espoused when a young man and it proved a joy and comfort to him in his right manhood. So I was kind of surprised to see, for him becoming president of the bank. Evidently he didn't have to have that education somehow, to make that leap from making the shoes. Does anybody know? I mean, obviously, he was a businessman, but
Probably not.
just didn't. You could just. Okay. If it is true that one is only great as one is good, then in that sense, Thomas E. Cannell was a great man. Does anyone have any questions? Roger.
How many terms did he serve in the Senate, or how long?
I don't know that he got in. He ran, but he was defeated by Mitchell.
I have a letter written by my great-grandfather, Pierce Mitchell, from the State House in 1871. He was a state senator. So that's all I know.
Mitchell was a state senator.
Yeah.
Okay.
He was.
Okay. Yeah, I couldn't find, I looked up those records and you could see all the names, and I couldn't find where he ever was a senator, but if he ran far ahead on the ticket.
Yeah, that's why I wondered. He said he ran far ahead, but
Yeah.
he didn't win.
Yeah, I don't understand that. Because I believe when I found it, still Mitchell was,
All I know is I have a letter with the State House,
okay.
heading on it.
Well, and wouldn't it have been in the obituary if he had been a state senator? I think that would be something to be noted there.
Well, there were so many things noted in that obituary. But yes, that would make sense. That would be pretty important.
They didn't have them in the state records?
That's what I couldn't, when I looked at the state records, I couldn't find them in there. I could not find them there. So if anybody else finds out about that, please let me know. And again, I've been mentioning to Bonnie that, this man deserves to be in our Hall of Fame. I mean, for everything that he did for Maquoketa, and probably why we just don't know, haven't heard much about him. I mean, he didn't have any biological children. He didn't have anyone to carry on that name, so as far as I know, yes.
I didn't hear, did Helen say his relation to them, the Mitchells?
Yeah, Helen is that.
Great-granddaughter.
Great-grandfather, okay.
Not of Cannell.
Of Mitchell,
Yeah.
who defeated Cannell in the one election, I know that for sure. And maybe it just was, and this was that excerpt that I told about that he ran far ahead, that was in one of our history books here, so. And it's possible, just wrong information, I don't know. They might not have had access to.
It must have been rigged.
Or maybe it was just in one section of the county he ran far ahead, but overall he didn't.
Oh, that could be,
That's
that could be, yeah.
But he does, he belongs to the Hall of Fame, right? So,
I mean, it just sounded like every time, they were in need of doing something big, it's like, we gotta get Cannell back in here, whether it was the auditor, or whether he was the supervisor, or the mayor, or, yeah.
it's just kind of strange that, we have all these names that we hear, the Mitchell name, the Goodnow name, and on and on and on. But his name just never seems to be out there. So this is wonderful that you brought his name to our attention. That's good. And I'm wondering, Sue, if maybe we do have a picture of him, because those of you who remember Mark Straff, he did a really nice round that lunch on mayors of Maquoketa, where he collected photographs and things that I never thought.
So there might be a picture of him from
There
when he was
might be.
mayor.
So we should at least check
That would be nice, we could tag that on here when it.
Right, we should look for that.
Yeah.
Excellent job.
Thank you.